An 8-year-old girl's simple question silenced a crowded town hall and left Shaq O'Neal sharing a deeply personal story about faith loss and redemption. What happened next moved everyone to tears. Before continuing this amazing story, let us know where are you watching from. Also, subscribe the channel, because tomorrow we have an amazing story for you. Let's begin the story. The Church Fellowship Hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, was filled with a gentle buzz of conversation. Rows of folding chairs scraped against the polished wooden floor as people shifted to find comfortable positions. The room smelled faintly of coffee and worn hymn books. It was a modest space, simple but welcoming, with whitewashed walls and soft, yellow lighting from hanging bulbs. Families, retirees, and curious locals filled the room, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. Some leaned forward, whispering to their neighbors, while others sat back with folded arms, waiting for the evening's discussion to begin. Among them were parents holding restless toddlers, older couples with kind smiles, and a few teenagers scrolling on their phones with mild disinterest. Shaquille O'Neal, towering at over 7 feet tall, stood near the front, commanding the room with his presence without even trying. His tailored dark suit fit perfectly, emphasizing his calm but powerful demeanor. Though Shaq was often known for his playful sense of humor, tonight he wore a more serious expression. His deep voice, rich and steady, had a magnetic quality that pulled everyone's attention. He cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice smooth but purposeful. "Good evening, everyone," he said, a warm smile briefly softening his serious face. "Thank you for having me here tonight. I know I usually come to talk basketball, but tonight I want to talk about something even more important: life, faith, and giving back." The crowd hushed as his words resonated through the small hall. Shaq was a storyteller by nature, weaving personal experiences into his message about discipline, perseverance, and the importance of lifting others up. He shared stories about growing up with a strict mother who never let him give up, even when life got tough. She'd say, "Boy, don't cry about it. Do something about it," Shaq recalled with a small laugh. "And trust me, when my mama said something, you listened." The audience chuckled lightly, their initial stiffness beginning to melt. Yet, despite his charm, there was a subdued energy in the room, as though people were listening politely, but holding something back. Toward the back of the hall, an 8-year-old girl named Lily sat nervously beside her mother. She was a small, serious child with intense brown eyes and curly hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She wore her best Sunday dress, a pale blue with a lace collar, and clutched a worn Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. "Go on, sweetheart," her mother whispered gently, giving her a nudge. Lily bit her lip, her heart thudding in her chest. She wanted to ask a question, but wasn't sure if she'd be brave enough. What if everyone laughed? What if Mr. O'Neal didn't know the answer? But then she remembered her grandmother's words. "Never be afraid to ask questions, Lily. Sometimes they're the keys to finding truth." Taking a deep breath, Lily stood up, her small frame almost lost among the rows of seated adults. The quiet shuffle of feet and murmurs faded as people noticed her. Shaq paused mid-sentence, his sharp eyes softening as he spotted the young girl standing nervously with her Bible. "Well, look at you," he said kindly, leaning forward slightly. "You got a question for me?" Lily swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. But she found her voice, soft but steady. "Yes, sir," she said. "What does God mean to you?" The room went completely silent. Folding chairs creaked as people shifted in their seats, leaning forward to hear Shaq's response. The weight of Lily's simple but profound question hung in the air. Shaq blinked, caught off guard. His usual quick wit and ready answers seemed to momentarily desert him. He rubbed a hand over his chin, his expression thoughtful. "That's a big question, young lady," he said finally, his voice low and steady. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing the significance of the moment. Shaq wasn't just a basketball legend. He was a man who had faced life's highs and lows in the public eye. Lily's question had cut through the surface and reached something deeper. For a few seconds, there was only silence. And then Shaq began to speak. Not as a celebrity, but as a man who had wrestled with faith just like everyone else. Lily stood there, her question lingering in the thick silence of the room. For a moment, the small fellowship hall in Shreveport felt even smaller, as though everyone in the audience had stopped breathing at once. Folding chairs creaked as people leaned forward, waiting to hear what Shaquille O'Neal would say to this unexpected, profound question from such a young girl. Shaq's expression softened as he looked at Lily. He was no longer the towering basketball legend people saw on TV or in commercials. At that moment, he was just a man caught in deep thought. He rubbed his hand across his jawline, searching for the right words. "That's a big question, young lady," he said finally, his voice lower and more serious than before. "Bigger than basketball, bigger than fame." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Shaq glanced down at the worn Bible Lily clutched tightly in her small hands, as though it were a lifeline. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was really asking. "You know," he said after a pause, "I didn't always have an answer to that question. And I still don't have all the answers. But here's what I've learned so far." The audience shifted, captivated by this uncharacteristic vulnerability. "When I was a kid," Shaq began, "my mama always made sure I was in church on Sunday mornings. No excuses. Didn't matter if I was tired or if we had practice the night before. We were gonna be in that pew, listening to the pastor talk about God, faith, and life. And back then, I just went because I had to. I didn't really get it, you know?" He let out a small laugh, shaking his head at the memory. "But then, life happened," he continued, his voice growing steadier. "And let me tell you something, Lily. Life will throw stuff at you that you don't see coming. Pressure, loss, doubts, all of it. There were times when I thought, maybe God forgot about me. Times when I was mad at him because I didn't understand why certain things were happening." A faint murmur rippled through the room as people nodded in quiet agreement. They had all been there in one way or another, questioning faith when life became too heavy to bear. "But you know what my mama told me?" Shaq asked, his eyes scanning the room before landing back on Lily. "She said, faith is knowing there's a plan, even when you don't understand it yet." That stuck with me. Lily's small face remained serious, but her eyes were wide, soaking in every word. "I'm going to be real with you," Shaq said honestly. "I've made mistakes. I've been lost. But every time I got knocked down, I learned that faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about getting back up even when I didn't have them. It was about believing that I wasn't alone, even when it felt like I was." He paused, letting his words sink in. "That's what God means to me," he said simply. "It's that quiet voice that says, keep going. Even when you're scared. Even when you don't know what's next." Lily's lip trembled, but she didn't look away. Shaq's words had touched something deep within her young heart. For a few moments, there was only silence in the room. People wiped at their eyes or sat quietly, reflecting on their own struggles and questions about faith. Finally, a rugged man near the back stood up, clearing his throat. His voice was rough, but sincere. "I gotta say," he began, "I've been struggling myself, man. Lost my job last year, and it's been tough to believe there's any plan in that, you know?" Shaq nodded, his expression filled with empathy. "I hear you, brother," he said. "But here's the thing. Faith ain't about never falling. It's about getting back up. Keep planting seeds. even if you don't see anything growing yet." The man nodded thoughtfully, as though those words were exactly what he needed to hear. An elderly woman with silver hair and a fragile frame spoke next. Her voice wavered as she shared, "I lost my husband last year. He was my rock, and it's been hard to believe God is still with me when I feel so alone." Shaq's eyes softened further. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," he said gently. "I can't pretend to know your pain, but I do know this. God doesn't leave us in our pain. He's right there, even when we can't see him. Sometimes you just gotta sit still long enough to feel it." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes but a faint smile tugging at her lips. Then, to everyone's surprise, Lily spoke again, her voice clear despite her nervousness. "My grandma used to say," she began, "that faith is like planting seeds. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will." A hush fell over the room. Even Shaq looked genuinely moved by the wisdom in Lily's simple words. "Your grandma sounds like a wise woman," Shaq said softly, giving Lily a respectful nod. "She was," Lily replied, her voice steady with pride. In that small church hall, strangers who had come expecting an ordinary talk found themselves sharing something deeper, stories of struggle, loss, and hope. And at the heart of it all was a brave little girl whose simple question had opened a door for healing and connection. The room remained still, holding on to the weight of Lily's innocent yet profound question. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the front, no longer just the larger-than-life figure from TV screens or the basketball court. He seemed smaller now, not in size, but in vulnerability. Shaq took a deep breath, his gaze distant, as if recalling moments long buried. "You know," he began quietly, "people see me today and think I got it all figured out. But that ain't the truth. My journey hasn't been easy, and there were plenty of times I almost lost myself along the way." The audience leaned in closer, drawn by his honest tone. Lily's eyes stayed fixed on him, her small hands still gripping her grandmother's Bible tightly. "When I was a kid," Shaq continued, "my family didn't have much, but we had discipline. My stepdad, Sergeant Philip Harrison, was strict, real strict. He made sure I respected people, worked hard, and stayed out of trouble. And my mama? She was the rock. She never let me forget where we came from or who we answered to." He smiled faintly, the memory of his mother softening his expression. "She'd wake me up early on Sunday mornings," he said, "dragging me to church even when I didn't want to go. 'Boy,' she'd say, 'you better get up and put on that nice shirt. We got a seat waiting for us.' And when Mama spoke, you listened. No excuses." A few people chuckled, nodding in agreement. They understood the unyielding authority of a Southern church-going mother. Shaq's smile faded slightly as he moved deeper into his story. "But I gotta tell you, even with all that church, I didn't really get it back then. I was just a kid dreaming about playing ball and getting out of the neighborhood. Faith felt distant, like something for old folks and preachers, not me." He paused, his voice growing heavier. "Then life happened, and it hit hard." The room grew quieter. People sat up straighter, sensing that Shaq was about to reveal something raw. "You see," he said slowly, "fame ain't what people think it is. Yeah, I had money. Yeah, I had trophies. But I also had pressure. Pressure to always be perfect. Pressure to always win. Pressure to be something bigger than I felt inside." He glanced down briefly, gathering his thoughts. "And when you're in that kind of spotlight, you start to lose pieces of yourself. I made mistakes. Hurt people I cared about. And I'll be honest with y'all, there were nights when I sat in my big old house with everything a man could want and still felt completely empty. The crowd was silent, captivated by his unexpected vulnerability. But the hardest thing, Shaq continued, his voice tightening, was losing people I loved. Close friends, mentors, folks who kept me grounded. I remember when my sister Aisha passed. That broke me, man. I was angry. Angry at life, at God, at everything. I didn't understand how someone so good could be taken away. A few people in the audience wiped their eyes, sharing his pain. Shaq's voice softened. I stopped praying for a while. Didn't see the point. But one night, I was alone, and I just broke down. I sat there in the dark and said, God, I don't get it. I don't understand why this is happening. And you know what? I didn't hear a voice. There was no magical answer. He paused, his eyes scanning the audience before landing back on Lily. But something changed inside me that night. I realized that faith isn't about getting all the answers. It's about believing even when you don't have them. It's about trusting that God's got a plan, even when you can't see it. Lily's eyes glistened, her young mind processing his words. My mama used to say, Shaq added, his voice softening, you don't need to see the whole staircase, Shaquille. Just take the next step. And that's what I did. One step at a time, even when it didn't make sense. The room remained silent, the weight of Shaq's story hanging in the air. You see, he said, addressing everyone now, faith ain't about never falling. It's about getting back up. And trust me, I've fallen plenty of times. But every time, I remembered what my mama taught me. God's still there, even when you can't see him. There was a pause before an elderly man near the front spoke up. Thank you for that, son, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sometimes us older folks forget that even giants fall. Shaq nodded respectfully. Yes, sir, he said. And giants got to get back up too. Lily's voice broke the silence. So, even when you felt lost, God was still there? She asked, her voice hesitant but curious. Shaq smiled warmly. Yeah, little lady, he was there. I just had to be still long enough to feel it. The audience sat quietly, their hearts moved by the raw honesty of Shaq's story. Struggles they had carried in silence suddenly felt shared, as though Shaq's journey mirrored their own in ways they hadn't expected. And in the middle of it all was Lily, the small girl with a big question that had led them all to a moment of truth. For a few long moments, the church fellowship hall remained hushed, as though Shaq's words had wrapped themselves around every heart in the room. People sat still, lost in thought, absorbing the weight of his story, the fame, the loss, the doubts, and the persistent flicker of faith that kept him moving forward. Then, like ripples on a calm pond, the atmosphere began to shift. A rugged man, with calloused hands and a worn trucker hat, stood from his seat near the back. He cleared his throat, voice rough with emotion. I just gotta say, man, the man began, I've been in a dark place myself. Lost my job last year after 20 years on the same crew. It's been hard, you know? Real hard. I tried to keep faith, but some days it just feels pointless. Shaq nodded, his deep brown eyes filled with understanding. I hear you, brother, he said, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. It ain't easy. But let me tell you something. Faith ain't about not struggling. It's about pushing through even when it feels impossible. Just like when I was on the court, Some games, you get knocked down over and over, but you gotta keep getting back up, even if you're bleeding and tired. The man wiped at his eyes, nodding slowly. Yeah, he said quietly. Guess I needed to hear that. Shaq offered him a respectful nod. We all need reminders sometimes. Next, an elderly woman with soft silver hair and a delicate frame raised her hand. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. O'Neill," she began gently, "I lost my husband last year. He was my rock, my best friend for 50 years. Since he's been gone, I've been struggling to find my faith again. Some days I wonder if God even remembers me." A wave of empathy swept through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, feeling her pain as though it were their own. Shaq's expression softened. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't pretend to know your pain, but I do know this. God doesn't leave us in our grief. He's right there with us, even when we can't see or feel him." The woman nodded, her lips quivering with gratitude. "And you know what else?" Shaq added, his voice steady but kind. "Sometimes God shows up through the people around us. Your friends, your family, even strangers. Don't be afraid to lean on them. You don't have to carry that weight alone." A few people murmured softly, moved by his words. Then, from the center of the room, Lily's small voice broke through the heavy silence. "My grandma used to say," she began shyly, "that faith is like planting seeds. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will." The simplicity and wisdom in her words caught everyone off guard. Shaq blinked, visibly moved. "Your grandma sounds like a wise woman," Shaq said warmly, his deep voice tinged with admiration. "She was," Lily said softly, her eyes shining. "She said even when you can't see the seeds, you have to keep watering them and trust they'll grow someday." Shaq nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the truth in her words. "That's real right there," he said. "Faith is just like that, believing even when you don't see the results yet." The audience began to shift, their reserved demeanor melting into something warmer, more connected. Strangers exchanged glances, some smiling, others dabbing at their eyes. A middle-aged man in a denim jacket stood up. "You know," he said, "I came here tonight expecting to hear basketball stories. But this hit different. We don't talk about stuff like this enough." There were murmurs of agreement throughout the room. Shaq nodded firmly. "That's true," he said. "We all go through stuff, loss, doubt, fear, but we keep it bottled up. And that's why nights like this matter, to remind each other that we ain't alone." The ripple effect continued. One by one, people began sharing their stories of heartbreak, resilience, and faith rediscovered in unexpected places. Some spoke through tears, others with quiet determination. An elderly man with a cane said, "I'm old enough to have seen it all, but hearing that young lady's words tonight reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Faith don't have to be loud. It just has to be steady." Lily's mother wrapped an arm around her daughter, whispering softly, "Your grandma would be so proud of you." Lily beamed, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and emotion. As the stories flowed and hearts opened, the atmosphere in the room transformed. What had started as a structured town hall event became something far deeper, a space for healing, connection, and reflection. And at the center of it all was a little girl with a brave question and a towering man who wasn't afraid to be honest about life's struggles. As the evening drew to a close, there was a lingering warmth in the air, a quiet understanding that something meaningful had taken place. The small fellowship hall in Shreveport was no longer just a venue for a scheduled talk. It had become a space where strangers found connection, healing, and renewed faith through stories shared with honesty and heart. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the front of the room, his massive frame somehow carrying a gentle energy. The audience watched him in respectful silence, waiting for his final words. Shaq took a breath and scanned the room, his eyes landing on familiar faces. The rugged man who spoke of job loss, the elderly widow grieving her husband, and of course Lily, who sat quietly with her Bible still clutched in her small hands. "I came here tonight thinking I was going to talk to y'all about discipline, hard work, and giving back, Shaq began, his deep voice calm but resolute. But what happened here? This was different. This was better. The audience nodded in agreement. You see, Shaq continued, faith isn't always about the big moments. It's not just about going to church or saying the right words. It's about those little moments like Lily's question tonight. It's about kindness from a stranger when you least expect it, or holding on to hope when life feels like it's falling apart. He paused, letting the words settle over the room. Faith, he said, is about trusting that even in the middle of the storm, you're not alone. And trust me, I've been through storms, more than I care to count. But I learned this. Storms don't last forever. They never do. A few people murmured softly, some nodding through tears. Shaq smiled gently, his gaze once again finding Lily. And sometimes, he added, it takes someone brave enough to ask a simple question to remind us of that truth. Lily blushed slightly, but held her head high. You got heart, young lady, Shaq told her sincerely. Don't ever lose that. Lily's mother whispered something in her ear, and Lily smiled shyly. Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, she said in her small but clear voice. For answering. The room erupted into soft applause, not the loud, celebratory kind, but a heartfelt acknowledgement of everything that had been shared and felt that night. As the applause faded, Shaq looked out over the crowd, one last time. Before I go, he said, I want to leave you with this. Ask yourself what faith means to you, and don't be afraid of the answer. Even if it's messy, even if it doesn't make sense yet, just keep asking, and keep believing. Because even when life feels uncertain, I promise you, you're never alone. The room was quiet, filled with a sense of peace and reflection. People exchanged glances, some smiling, others wiping away tears. Strangers who had walked in with their own burdens now seemed lighter, as though Shaq's words and Lily's courage had planted seeds of hope within them. As Shaq stepped off the small stage, people rose to their feet, offering a standing ovation. Not for a basketball legend, but for a man who had shared his heart and reminded them of the strength found in faith. He walked toward Lily, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. You're something special, Lily, he said warmly. Don't ever forget that. Lily grinned, her nervousness gone. My grandma used to say that too, she said proudly. Well, Shaq said with a smile, your grandma knew what she was talking about. They shook hands, a simple gesture that carried a world of meaning. As Shaq made his way to the exit, people lingered, sharing stories, hugs, and quiet moments of connection. The room that had once been filled with folding chairs and polite anticipation was now a place of genuine fellowship and renewed hope. Lily's mother leaned down and whispered in her daughter's ear, Your grandma would be proud. Lily nodded, holding her grandmother's Bible close to her heart. And as the evening faded into night, one simple truth remained clear. Sometimes, the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find the pieces of ourselves we didn't even know were missing. Weeks later, Lily would still talk about that night, the night she met Shaquille O'Neal and asked him a question that silenced a room. Her faith, like the seeds her grandmother spoke of, continued to grow quietly and steadily. And in the hearts of everyone present that evening, a similar growth was taking place. They carried the lessons of that night forward, lessons about resilience, faith, and the beauty of brave questions that open the door to healing and connection. I hope you like this story. Write your thoughts in the comment section. Also, subscribe Storyboat for daily upcoming stories like this.